Welcome for Deb Helton from Akron, Ohio.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Deb. I'm a real alcoholic. Hi. Wow, it is an honor and a privilege to be here. I say that almost every time I talk, and sometimes I mean it a little bit more than others. And tonight is one of those nights where I really mean it. It has been so wonderful to be here in Ruston, Louisiana with you this weekend. I'd like to thank Joe and Glenda for asking me to come and speak here. I don't think that y'all are happy if we leave here and we're not just a little chubbier than when we got here. I'm pretty sure that there's probably some entry scales and some exit scales, and that's how y'all weigh out your hospitality. But I can tell you that I have eaten plenty. Traveling on the road, I travel for work. I move a lot. I mean, every 2 or 3 years, I'm moving to a new state, a new location, and so there are lots and lots of days that can pile up on me where I don't get to spend time with people that I have history with. And this is one of those conferences where I get to come here and I see a lot of people who are familiar with me, and I get to spend some time with some people who know me. There's a whole group of folks from Palma who I have known now for 9 or 10 years. And so sometimes it's nice just to be in the company of folks that I have history with. And thank you. You didn't know that you were giving me that this weekend, but you've given me that. And I really appreciate it. I am from Akron, Ohio. I was born and raised in a tiny, tiny little town right outside of Akron, Ohio. I did not know that it was the mecca for Alcoholics Anonymous when I was little, nor did I care. I I didn't know that the greatest spiritual movement of the century was born just down the road in that tiny little industrial town. It had absolutely no bearing on my life whatsoever until I was delivered into the arms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And even once I was delivered into the arms of Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't know that it was a big deal. I really didn't. I remember the first time that I went to Founders Day, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, Founders Day is a weekend celebration in Akron, Ohio. It is Alcoholics Anonymous's birthday party every year, and it's held at the University of Akron, and we take over the entire city. They're averaging between 15 and 18,000 alcoholics every year who go to this deal, and it is a lot of fun. And the first time that I was drugged to the Founders Day celebration in Akron, Ohio, I was 16 years old. I was sober for about 3 months, and I was hot, and I just wanted to go home, and I didn't see what the big deal was. And I was sitting on a porch swing on Dr. Bob's front porch. And there was an old guy sitting on the porch swing, and I walked up, and there was a spot next to him, and I said, "Can I sit there?" And he said, "Well, sure." So I joined him on the porch, and we were sitting there swinging, and I and I got to talking to him, and I said, "So, how do you fit in around here?" And he said, "Well, I used to know the folks that lived in this house." And I said, "So what's the deal with the doctor? He seems to be a big deal around here." And he said, "Yes, he's one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous." And I said, "So you knew him?" And he said, "I did." And I said, "Did you like him?" And he said, "Not very much at all." And I said, "You didn't like him. Everybody seems to love him." And he said, "Yeah, I had a different experience with him." And I said, "Well, what was it?" And this man was Ray Windows. Ray Windows was the husband of Sue Windows, who was the 5-year-old adopted daughter of Dr. Bob and Ann Smith. And he had asked Dr. Bob for Sue's hand in marriage when they were 18 years old, and Dr. Bob said no, because Ray came from Ray's family, they were janitors. And Dr. Bob wanted his daughter to marry to a higher station in life, and so he would not give within such for them to marry. So both of them went off and married other folks. They were married a good long time. They were both widowed, and they re-met in Akron, and then they finally married. And he said, "So I finally got to marry the love of my life just about 40 years later than I wanted to." Anyway, so I was born and raised in a tiny little town right outside of Akron, Ohio. And that town, the name of it is Rittman. Not that that has any bearing on anything at all. You'd probably Google it and it wouldn't even pop up. It had a population of about 5,000 people. And all of those families, or the majority of them at least, came out of the hills of West Virginia when the coal mines started going through them. As the coal mine shut down, everybody came across and they were looking for jobs in the factories and they were hoping to get a good union job. My dad's family, that's where they came from. My mom's family, they came from Mills in Pennsylvania, similar story. And so they all came over. They settled in this tiny little town, and about 20 miles up the road, there were a bunch of factories to choose from. And so they all came there. They all got union jobs, and they started to put a life together that was worth living. My father has a terrible case of alcoholism, just a terrible case of alcoholism. And he's still alive today, and he is still just as alcoholic today, and he's completely untreated. And my dad, when I was growing up, my dad, when I was growing up, he was a daily drinker, absolutely daily drinker. He didn't necessarily drink the clock round because he'd get up and he'd go to work. But about the time that the withdrawal would kick in, he was getting off work. And so he was able to go get that 12-pack and drink it and then go back to the beverage drive-thru and get another 6-pack to finish off the night. And that was just a daily deal with him. I didn't know that there was anything wrong with that. I just thought that my dad was mean. I just thought that he was mean because he was mean all the time. Sometimes he would be mean and quiet, and sometimes he'd be mean and violent. And I never knew what I was going to get. Absolutely didn't know what I was going to get. So when I was a little girl, I was terrified all the time. I lived my life on eggshells. You know, I would do the exact same thing today that I did yesterday, and yesterday it was just fine, and today, for some reason, it's not okay. And he would just lose it, and I would get hurt. And so I never knew what the right fire action was. I never knew what the right fire action was. There was just no way to gauge that in the insanity that was alcoholism in my house. I knew that the stuff in those cans were very, very important to my dad. I knew that. It was important to my dad that he drank lots of it. It was very important to my mom that he have none of it. And that was the basic conflict in my house. And I remember when I was a little girl, I asked, I said, what is that stuff? I just wanted to know what that stuff was. And all I was ever told was, that stuff's for adults and you don't need to worry about it. And I remember thinking to myself, what do you mean I don't need to worry about it? It's really important. It runs everything around here. But they would never answer my question. And I can tell you, if I ask y'all a question tonight, and if you know the answer, please just give me the answer. Because if you don't, I'm going to go do research. And that's exactly why I had my first drink of alcohol. I wanted to know why alcohol was so incredibly important. I wanted to know why he had to have as much alcohol as he had. I just wanted to understand it. Now, I am terrified of everything because of the violence in my home and the unpredictable nature of my dad's alcoholism. I am terrified all the time. There are pictures of me when I'm a little girl. I have my hair up in ponytails. My shoulders are attached to my ears. My little hands are balled up in fists, and I just look mean. Well, I'm doing the best I can at 9 years old with ponytails to look mean. But I lived my life on high alert. Absolutely lived my life on high alert because I didn't know what was going to be coming, and I needed to be able to respond to it. And I didn't know that was directly tied to alcohol, but I knew that alcohol was creating a point of conflict and crisis at all times. So when I was 9 years old, I spent the night with one of my little girlfriends, and her parents had a bar in their basement. Now, alcohol in her family, it was a completely different deal. They had a tape-it or leave-it attitude about alcohol. They had a bar in their basement, but that's because sometimes they have friends over. And they'd have a few drinks, and they'd play music, and the adults would dance, and they would laugh, and they would sing and play games and all that kind of stuff, and nobody got yelled at. You know, the kids aren't sent away. It was just a completely different deal in their house. So I spent the night with her, and I had to talk her into drinking with me because for her, drinking wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a thing. So we went down in the basement that night, and we just started picking bottles off the bar based on their labels. We'd take the caps off and smell them, and if we thought we could choke some down, we'd go ahead and have a quick drink of it and see if we could actually swallow it. The first bottle I picked off the bar was Christian Brothers. I don't know why I remember that, but that particular bottle of Christian Brothers, it had Pilgrims on the label. Pilgrims made sense to me. I had just played one in the school play. And I used to say it was Christian Brothers whiskey. And I was telling my story one night, and there was a nun sitting in the audience, Sister Maurice, and she out loud in the middle of my talk, she said, "Honey, that's brandy." And I was like, well, leave it to the religious to know their booze. Anyway, that was a night of firsts for me. It was my first drink, my first drunk, my first blackout. The next day was my first hangover. And I probably didn't have more than a couple of swallows, but it doesn't take much when you're 9. And I absolutely hit the ground running. And the next day when I came to and I was real sick and I was trying to clean up and cover up and act like I was fine when I wasn't fine. And, it just started lying right off the bat. And the one thing that I remembered more than anything else was the feeling that I got when I got enough alcohol in my system. What it did for me was that it gave me relief when I needed it and I didn't know that I needed it. That night, my hands let loose, my shoulders came off my ears. I exhaled all the way for the first time. And I remember thinking, this is why my dad drinks. This is it. If alcohol does for him, if it does this for him, why wouldn't he drink? I didn't know that I needed relief. I didn't know that I was struggling. I didn't know that I was holding my breath. I didn't know that I was terrified. I had no idea. But when I got enough alcohol in my system and I was actually able to let all that fear fall away for the very first time, I thought, oh my gosh, this stuff is magic. It's magic. And my mom, she just needs a drink. I'm telling you. I mean, that woman is wound tight. She really was. She would follow him from room to room and just nonstop with just chatter, 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 chatter. And I thought, man, if she would just take a drink and calm down and sit down, everything would be fine. Because she's complaining all the time and she's in his ear and it's making him mad. And so I mean, my whole life and the perception of my home and the participants in it, it all shifted. And I thought, man, she just needs to drink and lay off of him. And I'm going to drink as much of this stuff as often as I can because this stuff is awesome. And the deal was, as soon as I sobered up, the fear was back on me. My shoulders were back on my ears. My hands were balled up in fists again. My breaths were shallow. And I was terrified all over again. And I just realized that if I could drink every single day, maybe I could feel a little relief every single day. And so that's what I set out to do. I reevaluated every relationship in my life based on whether or not you increased or decreased my access to alcohol. If your parents had a bar in the basement, you were in my inner circle. If you had older siblings and they got a little sloppy with their extras so you could pilfer them for us, you were in my inner circle outer ring. If you came from teetotalers, I'd hang out with you at school, but that's as far as it was going to go because I needed that extracurricular time to spend with people who could increase my access to alcohol. I mean, I absolutely went through everyone in my life. And and I can remember it like it was yesterday. And just kind of the people that the friends that I used to have and how I just wouldn't hang out with them anymore. And what that did for me was that it put me in a position to drink more and more and more and more and more often. And so by the time I'm 15 years old and going into my sophomore year in high school, I had drank my way into my own case of alcoholism. By the time I was 15 years old, and the summer before my sophomore year in high school, I was a daily drinker and I was drinking the clock round. In order for me to sober up and to show up, to keep one of those important appointments where I had to act right, it took 2 or 3 days of me shaking off a good drunk in order to be able to do that. I remember my mom, she was having a conversation, I think it was with my aunt on the telephone, and I remember I used to sit real still. When you grow up in an alcoholic household that's real violent like mine was, you learn how to sit real quiet and disappear into the woodwork so that you can hear what the adults are talking about so that you can gather the intel. And I was sitting real quiet because I was always trying to figure out what my mom knew and what my mom didn't know. And I heard her having this telephone conversation with my aunt. And she said, I'm going to have to get Deb to the doctor real soon because she's got the flu a lot these days. And it was because if I wasn't able to get enough to drink, I was going through serious withdrawal that was lasting several days. I didn't know that I had developed my own case of alcoholism. I didn't know what alcoholism was. I certainly didn't know that when I was 9 years old and trying to figure out what was going on in my house, I didn't know that I was opening myself up to developing an illness that was going to consume everything around me. I had no idea what I was in for. But by the time I was 15 years old, I was unable to draw a sober breath without going through a significant period of withdrawal. I was very, very sick. And what also happened for me over that short span of years, you see, my family, they made just enough money so that we lived on the right side of the tracks. But the tracks were in our backyard. We were on them. We were on the right side, but we were on them. And so all you had to do was look around and you could see the wrong side of the tracks. And so, and so what happened for me was the more I drank, the more I needed to drink. And in order for me to get access to the amount of booze that I was consuming, I had to hang out with people who scared me. I had to hang out with the kind of people that my parents would warn me about. I had to cross the tracks and go to the dark little house on the wrong side of the tracks where folks went on purpose just to stay off the radar. And it got so that I was going there every single day. And they were expecting me every day. And there would be a fifth of vodka sitting there waiting on me. And they knew that I was going to require that entire fifth just to get through a day. And I paid for that. I paid for that booze on the wrong side of the tracks in all manner of ways. So I was 15 years old. I didn't have a job. I didn't have money, but I paid. And if you're a young female alcoholic, like I think there's an entire table of them back there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. By the time I was 15 years old and a sophomore in high school, I hadn't been able to look in the mirror for 2 years because I couldn't stand who I was looking at. I hated who I was. I hated the things that I had done. I hated the places that I went. And I hated the fact that I had to drink every single day. The idea of not drinking was terrifying, and the idea of having to drink just made me sick to my stomach, but there was no choice left. Because that's what alcoholism does. Alcoholism takes us and it holds our head underwater and it won't let us out. And I was struggling to breathe. And what finally happened in my life is I finally got caught. It was that simple. I finally got caught. I had been able to run scams and keep folks looking right when I was moving left. And I was able to keep all the balls in the air. And I was able to do all of that for a period of time. And I was exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted and I missed a couple of details. And so the gig was up. And I'll spare you a lot of those details, but when I got caught, it hit the big time radar because I didn't go down small. And so there were warrants out for the arrest of all the people on the wrong side of the tracks because they were providing access to alcohol for minors and doing all kinds of things. And so the people who had come to our little town and lived on the railroad for a reason, because they wanted to stay off the radar, I skylined them. And so things got very tense and very ugly in our little town for a little while. And all I knew when I was 15 years old is that I needed to get out of town. Now, I didn't even know which direction out of town really was. And I didn't have a car and I didn't know where I was going to go. But I knew that I needed to get out of town because all the adults in my life were really overreacting. Every single one was overreacting. The police were overreacting. My parents were overreacting. The school officials were overreacting. Everybody was overreacting. And there was a girl in my high school and she had gotten sent away. She had gotten herself into some trouble. And so she had gotten sent away to a treatment center in downtown Cleveland. And in Cleveland, they had it was an inpatient deal. And for the first 10 days, you go in and you go through an inpatient assessment. And they would assess you to see if you had alcoholism or drug addiction, and then they would make recommendations based on the outcome of that assessment. Well, she had gone away for this assessment, and after her 10 days, they sent her home and said that she didn't have alcoholism and she didn't have drug addiction, so they sent her home. But when she got home, everybody felt really sorry for her because she had gone away for those 10 days, and they treated her like a little bit of a celebrity, and I thought, well, by God, that's what I need. I just need to get out of town. I need to be pampered for a little bit. And when I come back, everybody will be apologizing for overreacting to this little mess that I've created. And so I'm not going to give you all those details either, but on the Saturday after Thanksgiving in 1986, I checked into Glen Bay Hospital in downtown Cleveland to begin my 10-day inpatient evaluation. But for the 2 weeks prior to that, I knew that I had the date to go in this place. And I ran into an adult who I used to drink with, who had been in and out of that program for adults. And he informed me that they locked the adolescent unit in that hospital. Now, you see, I had a plan. I was going to go away for the 10 days. But while I was there, when the counselors went to sleep at night, I was going to sneak out. I was going to go have a little something to drink on the streets of Cleveland. I wasn't going to drink too much or, not going to go into oblivion, just enough to take the edge off. And then I'm going to sneak back in and I'm going to do this treatment thing for 10 days. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but that was my plan. And this guy told me that they locked the adolescent unit and that I wasn't going to be getting out of there. And I thought that was completely unreasonable, just completely unreasonable. And I was clearly not going to be able to execute my plan. And the bottom line was I was terrified of sobriety. I was terrified of sobriety. I was not interested in going for a full day without something to drink. I wasn't interested in having 10 days in a row of having nothing to drink. I just wasn't interested. You see, because when I'm sober, I'm really uncomfortable. Sobriety and being comfortable, those two things don't go hand in hand for me. I am terrified immediately. I am sick. I am full of shame. I can't breathe. And I am not interested in sobriety. Thank you very much. If you would just leave me alone and let me drink, I'll be fine. So I decided I was going to drink myself to death. And so I went on a run like I'd never been on before. And I drank and I drank and I drank and I kept coming to and I kept coming to. And I was doing everything I could to drink so that I would just die. I knew that I was getting really close to, I was just living with alcohol poisoning. It was just kind of nonstop and it was building up in my system and I was unable to eat. I couldn't hold the food down. I was an absolute wreck. And I thought, man, if I could just keep from passing out and drink a little bit more, a little bit faster, maybe it'll work this time. Because I just wasn't interested in getting sober. I wasn't interested in that 10 days. And so what happened to me was I did check into that treatment center on Saturday morning, but I don't remember getting there. Thank God I'm a blackout drunk. I don't remember getting there, and I didn't come out of that blackout until Monday afternoon. And on Monday afternoon, I came to, and what was apparent to me really quickly is that treatment center didn't believe that adolescents were real alcoholics because they weren't putting me through a medical detox. They had put me into a room, thrown me some pajamas, and they just let me shake it off. And after the run that I had just been on, it took me that full 10 days to be able to sit upright, to keep food down, to keep fluids in me, to just become constitutionally capable of participating in anything that looked like a program that the treatment center was offering. It took me that full 10 days just to be able to stay out of bed. And after that 10 days was over, what I realized also was that when I checked in there, when I was in that blackout for that 2 days, you see, I was going to tell them that I'd had a little something to drink a couple of times. I was going to really minimize how much I'd been drinking and with who and how often and all that kind of stuff, because I just knew that I was drinking a little much and that the adults in that treatment center would likely overreact too. So I had my story. But I went in there in a blackout, and in that blackout, I told them the absolute truth. I told him I'd been drinking a fifth of vodka a day at minimum, and more if I could get my hands on it. Because you see, I'm a real alcoholic. I am bodily and mentally different from my fellows. I really am. The moment I swallow alcohol, it's like a little switch gets flipped in me and it just flashes and says more. And I'm going to drink until something or someone gets in my way to stop me. I have alcoholism. And that's what alcoholism is. I have a head that will tell me that having another drink is my absolute best choice. When if you are looking at my life as an outsider, you know clearly that it is not. But I have a head that'll talk me into drinking every single time, and I have a body that can't handle it anymore. It just can't handle it anymore, but I'll drink it anyway, over and over and over and over. Anyway, so I had told them the absolute truth, told them how much I'd been drinking and with who and how often and all that kind of stuff. And before I even got out of that blackout, my chart had a little stamp on the front of it that said alcoholic. Now, I have a sister. And my sister is not quite 2 years older than me. She and I look a lot alike. And back then, we looked darn near identical. And I drank and my sister did drugs. That way there was no conflict of interest in our house. But my sister and I, we were running with the same people. We were crossing the tracks together, hanging out of the same houses and all that kind of stuff. But I am just drinking and she can't handle alcohol at all. So she's just doing her stuff. And so after that 10 days of that evaluation, they decided that they were going to keep me for some additional days of treatment. They gave me my clothes back and I went downstairs to start my 30-day treatment program, which I am not happy about at all. And I get down there to that floor and they call a code. And they call the code and the counselors are rolling up their sleeves and they're loosening their ties and they're headed right back up to where I just came from. And I grabbed one of them and I said, "What in the world's going on?" And they said, "Your sister's here." It turns out that while I was in my blackout, I also told them a lot about what my sister had been up to. So they had called my mom at home and they said, "You got another one. Let us get this one through the 10 days and then we'll bring in the other one." And so they brought in my sister. They tricked her. They said, "Don't you want to go in and see Deb?" And she was like, "Well, yeah. I mean, my sister and I were like this. She's my road dog. I don't do anything without her in my hip pocket and vice versa. And we cover for each other and we run scams together. And sometimes I act like I'm her and she acts like I'm me. And I mean, we're a mess." And I hadn't seen her in 10 days. And so she said, yeah, she wants to come in and visit me. Well, she got up to that unit, the door locked behind her. They threw her a set of pajamas and they said, "You'll be staying for 10 days. And she tore the place apart. She was very unhappy. So 10 days later, I'm downstairs trying to learn as little as possible and being a complete and utter disruption to the treatment process. And my sister comes down to start her 30 days because before they ever met her, based on my intel, they had already decided she was a drug addict. And so she comes downstairs and I went up to hug her. I was so happy to see her because now I am 20 freaking days sober. 20. I don't want to be sober. And I am now forced into 20 consecutive days of sobriety. I haven't seen my best friend and my road dog for 20 days. She's the one that makes me believe that everything's going to be okay. And I haven't seen her for 20 days. And I go running up to her and I went to hug her and I was like, "Oh my God, it's so good to see you." And she looked at me and she said, "Don't go to sleep." So I spent the last 20 days of my treatment stay trying to stay awake because they put us in adjoining rooms because we were sisters and they thought that, that we were used to sharing things like that. And all that meant is it gave her access to me. And in my family, we learned how to hold grudges. It was like a sport. It really was. And so she didn't let that go at all for that 20-day period. I went to get out of that treatment center. Now, I learned as little as possible in treatment. And how I did that was this. When you all were up giving lectures or running meetings or doing any of that kind of stuff, I would sit there and I would think about everything else that was going on. I wouldn't hear a word that you were saying. I wouldn't participate in groups. I wouldn't do anything in individual therapy. When my mom would come in for family counseling, she'd sit on one side and I'd sit on the other and we'd kind of run roughshod over the other families and made sure that they stayed in the hit cone. I mean, I did absolutely nothing to prepare myself for a life of sobriety because I wasn't staying sober. Thank you very much. I'm just not interested. Because when I'm sober, I'm uncomfortable. And when I'm sober, what happens to me is when I close my eyes, it's a merry-go-round of every single mistake, every single bad thing that ever happened to me in my life, every bad thing I'd ever done to anyone else. I lived in constant shame and remorse. And I didn't believe that there was a process or a person or an entity that would relieve me of any of that. Therefore, sobriety was not an option for me. So I did everything I could to learn as little as possible because I was not staying sober. And so when I was leaving that treatment center, my sister grabbed me as I was getting on the elevator and she said, "You do not drink until I get out of here. It is your fault that I'm in this place and you will not be out there drinking while I'm in here because of you." She said, "You wait on me to finish up out here, in here, and then we'll go out together." I said, "Fine." And I don't know why I was scared of my sister, but I was. And I don't know why I waited on her, but I did. So I went out and I got my bottles and I went to the dark house on the wrong side of the tracks and I got her some random stuff in baggies and I put it all on the floorboard and I waited for 10 days for my sister to get out of treatment. As she gets out of treatment, she rolls in and I went and grabbed her out of the car and took her upstairs real quick and I tipped the floorboard up and I was like, look, I got all our stuff. So tonight it's on. And she said, well, they call it a spiritual experience. And I said, no. She said, the counselors, they said it was a spiritual experience. We're going to stay sober. And I said, no, we're not. She said, yes, we're going to go to AA. And I said, we're not going to AA. And she said, yes, we are. I said, AA, you don't even drink. She said, I know, but they said NA sucks. I have to go to AA. And I said, I'm not going to AA. I'm drinking. And she said, you're not drinking because if you do, I'll tell. So here's how we went to AA. My mom dropped us off. My cool card is officially gone at this point. My mom drops us off at an AA meeting 15 minutes before the meeting's to start. We stand outside. We bum cigarettes. I don't smoke, but I learned. We stay outside and smoke cigarettes long enough to be late. Walk into the meeting late. I walk right up through the middle of the meeting so I can be as much of a disruption as possible. We met in all the church basements with the metal folding chairs that bang a lot when you scoot them. So I would drag the chair out from underneath the table, make sure that the chair banged around and made as much noise as possible. I didn't even like coffee, but I had 3 cups at every meeting. Up, down, up, down, up, down. I sat in the back. I wrote notes. I tried to get dates. There are men who think that newcomer adolescents are cute. I can still pick you out cold. Don't even go there and stay away from my girls. And when you people would circle up to pray, I would leave early because I wasn't getting in your stupid circle. Because here's the deal. I wasn't raised with God. I wasn't raised praying. I didn't know how to do that. And there's a lot of words in the Lord's Prayer, and you weren't going to pull my punk card like that. Thank you very much. And that's how we went to Alcoholics Anonymous. And we did this for a couple of months. Now, I'm working on my sister from the outside, trying to talk her into relapsing with me. And my sister's illness is working on her from the inside because here's the deal. My sister was in the wrong room. We do folks a disservice when we don't make sure that they're in the right room. My sister didn't have alcoholism. My sister had a problem with drugs. She wasn't in the right room, so she wasn't hearing her story. I could relate to the stories that were coming from the podium. I just wasn't listening. My sister was listening and trying to hear her story, and her story wasn't being told at the podiums about Alex. They were being told in this fellowship that she was sent to the wrong one. I was sneaking out of the meeting one. Now, the president of Alcoholics Anonymous, his name is Max Shadburn. Max Shadburn is passed now, but Max Shadburn had been sober since Christ was a child. And Max's assigned position was in the back of the room, right by the entry and exit door. And he and all of our guys, they formed the gauntlet that you had to walk through when you entered the meeting. And they were kind of the old-fashioned sniffers. We were talking about sniffing perfume earlier. They were the old-fashioned sniffers. And so when you would walk into the room, they'd shake your hand. If you didn't look quite right, they'd pull you in real close and they'd go. And if you smelled like booze, you disappeared into the side room. Now, I didn't know what happened in the side room, but I didn't really want to find out either. But so there was old school stuff going on at this AA meeting. And Mac ran everything from the back of the room, except when Jane got there. Now, Jane and Mac had been sober about the same amount of time, and they were both in their 70s. And Jane, when she would come to the meeting, she had an assigned parking place out back. There was always a newcomer who drove Jane to the meeting, and they pulled in right next to the stairs that came down into the basement. And somebody would yell down, and they'd say, Jane's here. And 4 newcomers would go grab this wooden high-back chair. They'd carry it out to the side of the car. They would load Jane into it, and they would carry her down the steps and across, and they would place her right here in front of the podium. And she would get the only crystal ashtray in the whole joint. The rest of us were using those old metal ones where once you put your cigarette butts out in them, the bottoms got real wavy. Those tin things. And she got the only nice ashtray in the whole place. And she had white hair that was pulled back in a bun. And she had a glow around her. And she smoked cigarettes on an extender. And she knew and loved everybody, and everybody loved Jane, and they just couldn't wait for her to get there, and I hated her. I hated her. I wouldn't go anywhere near her. I hung out in the back corner as far away from Mac and Jane as I can get. You pick them two, and you pick me, and it's a perfect triangle, because I'm not getting close to that. I don't know what they're doing, but I'm not getting sucked into it, because I know they're going to take over my entire life. And so I am scooting out of the meeting one night, and I had to slide down the back wall. And I'm sliding down the back wall, and I've been doing this for a couple of months. And I'm looking this way, and I'm sliding that way, trying to see if I'm getting caught. And I bumped into something. And that something was Mac. Mac had gotten up from the table, and he had stood in the doorway, and he was standing there like this. And he had these ridiculous little glasses that he wore real low on his nose. And I don't know why he had them, because he never looked through them. Just over him. And he looked at me and he said, "Get in the circle." So I got in the circle. And I bowed my head really low so that you wouldn't see that I didn't know the words to the Lord's Prayer. And as soon as that prayer was over, I went to leave again, and Mac had not gotten in the circle. And he was still standing there in the door. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you alcoholic?" And I gave him the only answer that I had. And he said, "Can you control your drinking?" And I gave him the only answer that I had. Now, you people were obsessed with controlling your drinking. There were entire meetings, and all they did was talk about how they tried to control their drinking. And I always thought to myself, while you all are talking about controlling your drinking, I thought, why in the world would you control your drinking? I mean, what's the point of that? What are you going to do? Have to take the edge off and stop? I'm drinking for oblivion. You know what I mean? I've taken the cap off the bottle, throwing the cap away, and drinking the whole thing. I'm not stopping. I don't want to stop. I want to drink as much as I can. Like, I'm going for face down good night. And you people are talking about whether or not you can control your drinking. I don't even get it. Can you control your drinking? How should I know? Now I understood. So I said, he took $5 out of his pocket. He handed me that $5 and he said, "Here's $5. Go find out. I'm tired of you treating Alcoholics Anonymous like a joke. Go try to control your drinking. If you can't, you get back here. And if you can, I never want to see you again." And I went and I got my sister, and I'm like, "Go get your $5. We're out of here." I've just been looking for somebody to give me permission. I mean, because at this point, I'm sober like 5 months against my will. I'm flipping miserable. I got no God. I got no program. There's these meetings with these old people in it, and I'm not interested. And I'm uncomfortable, and I have nightmares all the time. And so I'm not sleeping, and I'm not eating because I'm sick to my stomach because I'm so full of shame I can't breathe. And that's what I got at 5 months, sitting in Alcoholics Anonymous doing nothing. And now I got a ticket, and now I'm finally going to go get some relief. But you people had seeped into my head. It had seeped in. And I thought, I wonder if I can control my drink. I'm going to give this a try. I bet I can. I've been sober 5 months now. And the way I was drinking before, well, it raised just a few too many flags, and some folks got in my business. So maybe if I can drink again, but just not drink quite so much. Like, I don't want to cross the tracks again, because not crossing the tracks, I mean, my quality of life is instantly better already. So I don't want to cross the tracks anymore. I don't want to drink to oblivion all the time. So maybe this whole controlled drinking thing, maybe this is the deal. You know, maybe it'll work. And so I'm going to have 2 shots and 3 beers, because to me, that's very moderate drinking. And so I go out, and my sister is with me, and she's doing whatever it is she's doing. And I have my 3 shots and 2 beers, and I drink them real fast, and I wait for the effect, because my shoulders have been pinned to my ears for 5 months. and my hands hurt, and I've been on high alert the entire time, and I've had no relief. I've had no relief. And so I drink them real fast, and I'm hoping that it works. And my hands let loose just a little, and my shoulders start to come up my ears. But they don't come all the way on. And I think, you know what? I think my equation was just a little off. I'm not going to drink to oblivion. I'm not doing that this time. I'm just going to have one more. And I'm going to have one more, and one more, and one more. And before you know it, I'm in a blackout. I'm drinking out of the neck of the bottle. I have no idea how much I've had. I come to the next day, and I'm sick, and I'm beat up. And I look in the mirror for the first time in years. And God slipped in. And what I heard was, you're young, you're otherwise healthy, and you're going to drink like this for a long time. And then I heard Max Shadburn's voice. If it doesn't work, you get back here. I walked into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous that day. It was March 15th, 1987. I got there on time. I sat in the middle. I only had one cup of coffee, and I got in the stupid circle. And when the circle was done and I went to leave that room, Mac was standing in the doorway again. And he looked at me and he said, "Did you get a sponsor?" And I looked at him and said, "No." And he just went like this. And I walked back in that room, and I walked up to every woman in that room, and I said, "Will you sponsor me?" And every woman in the room went, "No." And so I went to leave the room again, and Mac's still standing there, and he said, "Well, how'd it go? Did you get a sponsor?" And I said, "No one in here will sponsor me." He said, "That's a lie." I said, "I'm not asking her." He said, "Oh, yes, you are." And I said, "Oh, no, I'm not." So I walked up to the front of the room where Miss Jean was sitting in all of her loveliness. And I waited my turn, which I'm not a big fan of. And when it was finally my turn, I just looked at her and I said, "Will you sponsor me?" And she looked at me and she took a drag off that cigarette extender. And she said, "Oh, honey, why should I?" And instead of telling her where to shove that cigarette extender, which is all I brought to the party, I said something like, "Because I need to be sober and I don't know how." And I thought, "We said that?" And she said, "Well, in that case, I guess you'll be doing some things differently now, won't you?" "Yes, ma'am." And I got the list of everything I was going to be doing, and the list of everything I was no longer going to be doing. And I left the meeting and I was completely defeated. The next day, I'm sitting after school, I'm doing my homework, and I'm contemplating how I've just turned my will and my life over to the care of 70-year-olds. And life as I know it was over. And it's 7 o'clock. This car floats in my driveway. Do you guys remember the old Ford LTDs from the 70s? Do you remember how enormous those cars are? And they would float down the road. And they had steering wheels on them that were about that big around. And you could steer with one finger, but if you wanted to make a turn, you had to start a half a block back. And then the car would consider it. And then it would float around the curve. And the body was like too big for the chassis or something, because when you stopped the car kind of went like this. Well, one of those cars comes floating in my driveway. And my mom said, "I wonder who's here." I said, "I don't know, I'll go find out." So I walked up to the car and knocked on the window, and there's two old guys sitting in the front seat, and they're smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee and listening to country music, laughing about something. And they rolled down the window, and I said, "Can I help you?" And they said, "Jane sent us, get in the car." And I said, "No, I'm good. I went to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous last night. I'm fine." And they just said, "Jane sent us, get in the car." And I went in the house and I was like, "Mom, Ace here?" She said, okay, honey, have fun. I'm like, yeah, right? So I go out and I get in the back seat of this car, and I'm the only person in the back. You could fit 12 newcomers in the back seat of a Ford LTD. And I'm in this car, and we go to the meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we get there, and we're the first people there. You know why? Because we're the Senate committee. And I'm just thrilled. So we're setting up tables and chairs, and I'm making coffee and coffee pots that are as tall as I am. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is my life, right? This is it. And so then the meeting starts, and it's the Barberton Monday night meeting, and it's a speaker meeting, and there's white hair row. All down this one wall, everybody who's real old with white hair, they all sit down this row. And they've all been hanging out with each other for like 60 years in Alcoholics Anonymous. And the speaker gets up and talks, and in Northeast Ohio, this is still true to this day. I just went to a meeting the other day, speaker. They will open the floor for comments to the speaker when the speaker gets done. That doesn't always go well. So they open the floor for comments, and the speaker, well, he wasn't exactly on in all of his facts. So he was gently corrected. And I was just watching all this, and I thought, man, I just don't know about this at all. And the meeting was finally over. We had to clean up the meeting and put the coffee pots back and do that whole mess. And we're back in the car. And I thought, well, thank God that's over. I mean, right now it's been like a 4-hour movement already. I am done. Like, I just want to go home. And you know what happens after meetings in Northeast Ohio? You have to go to the donut shop. And you know what you do at the donut shop after meetings in Northeast Ohio? You discuss everything you just discussed in the meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think they're going over it a second time because they think I'm stupid or something. But we go through everything that just happened at the meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if it was a speaker meeting, that's where the true inventory of it's taken. So if anybody's taken my inventory, if you'd kindly write it down for me, it'll save me a little work later on. Thank you. So, anyway, I get home at like midnight, and it's a school night. And I'm like, Jesus, this Alcoholics Anonymous thing's going to kill me. And the next night at 7 o'clock, guess what happens? It's a different colored Ford LTD. And I go out and I'm like, seriously? Like, I've been to AA 2 days in a row. And they said, we don't care, get in the car. And what had happened was they had held an emergency group conscience. Mac had called it. He said, we're going to have to throw these girls out at Alcoholics Anonymous. They're ruining it. And so, in this emergency group conscience, they were talking about how to throw us out of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they had almost the entire room. You know, it was kind of mob mentality. Yep, they got to go. And for those of you in service, you'll appreciate this. There's a minority voice in the room, a minority opinion. There was one man who never talked. His name's Bill Long. And I know that Bill Long never talked because I logged miles and miles with Bill Long. He owned the Maroon 4 LTD. And Bill Long speaks up from the back of the room, and he said, well, the way I see it is that God gave us those girls, therefore they are our responsibility. So we probably ought to try to put them onto the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he turned the room on a dime. And they said, well, all right, how are you going to do it? And Max said, it says in the big book that we can tell them to try to control their drinking. And they said, that's fine, Max. We can tell them to try to control their drinking so we can toss them out. And they said, but then what are we going to do if they come back? And they said, well, somebody's going to have to sponsor them. And there's another guy sitting in that room, and he said, I had the feeling that these girls have been pretty badly damaged by most people in their lives. And the only people that might have a shot at them are those of us with white hair. And they all looked at Jane. And Jane said, I don't have the energy to sponsor those girls. And so the group said, Jane, if you'll sponsor them, we'll all help. So I had a Monday crew, a Tuesday crew, a Wednesday crew, a Thursday crew, a Friday crew. I had a crew for every single day of the week. And I got to know what days folks were coming to pick me up and what kind of meetings they were going to take me to. and whether or not I was going to get to go to my favorite donut shop or my second favorite donut shop. And they were always there at 7 o'clock. And we always went to the meeting, and we always went to the donut shop. And those old guys sat with me in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous at donut shops across Northeast Ohio, and they put me onto the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And they did it line by line. And we spent a lot of time going through the doctor's opinion in the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, because that's where the explanation of alcoholism lives. And what they knew is that if I didn't concede to my innermost self that I had alcoholism, the way it's described in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was not ever going to believe that I belonged here. Because if you bring up the first step in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and it's a discussion, you're going to have people talking about how many times they've been in prison and how many cars they wrecked and how many kids they gave up to CPS and all that stuff. And you know what? Those things are outcomes of drunkenness. They do not define whether or not you have alcoholism. Alcoholism is an illness. It's an obsession of the mind, coupled by an allergy of the body. And I needed to know what alcoholism really was, because I wasn't going to qualify any other way. Line by line, page by page, action by action, they put me onto the program of Alcoholics Anonymous as it's outlined in that book. They taught me not only how to work the steps, but how to use the big book in practicing the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. They gave me a foundation in Alcoholics Anonymous that has been absolutely unshakable. When it came to the God stuff in Alcoholics Anonymous, I had a God squad. And these were folks who are completely dedicated to making sure that I started to build some kind of a relationship with God. And I wasn't raised in church, and we didn't talk about God, and we didn't pray, and we didn't do any of that. I had picked up randomly some idea that if there is a God, he wasn't going to have anything to do with me, because I had sinned beyond repair. That's what I had believed. If there was one, I was beyond repair, and so he wasn't going to have anything to do with me. And those old men sat at those donut shops, and they told me their stories in the kind of detail that we don't go into at these podiums. And I got to understand that there was a God, that his number one job where we were concerned was to convince us that he loved us and that he forgave us and that we were worth it. And I got that by sitting in donut shops, listening to them tell their stories in the level of detail that I needed. And I came to believe that there was a power greater than myself, that he could restore me to sanity, and that he would and already had when I least deserved it in my own mind. They placed me into the arms of God. God placed me into the arms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Alcoholics Anonymous placed me into the arms of God. They taught me how to pray. I was taking all of my big problems to the donut shops, and I was running them past all the old guys. And there were some of them, they were just so annoying. This one guy'd look at me time after time, and he'd say, "Did you pray about it? Did you pray about it? Did you pray about it? Did you pray?" And finally, one night I looked at him and I said, "I don't know how." He said, "Give me your book." And I slid my big book across the table. He opened it up and he started underlining and highlighting every little prayer that's in the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. He slammed it shut, shoved it back, and said, "Pick one and try it. But get on your knees when you do it and try to mean it." And so that night I got on my knees. I opened up my big book on the side of my bed, and I had to pray with one eye open so that I read the words correctly. And I started to pray for the very first time. And what I can tell you is that God does not make too hard of terms with those who seek him. He does not. Those old men prayed that God would reveal himself to me, and he did, in measure after measure. And by the time I left them to go to college, not only had I worked the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was familiar with the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, because they believed that if I didn't understand my history, that I would not love and respect and honor and protect my program. And so they taught me the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, how to use the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the sacrifices of those who had gone on before me. and they put me into the loving arms of God. And they convinced me that when I was having a bad day, that the only thing that would make it better was reaching my hand out and helping another alcoholic. And they demonstrated that to me day after day after day. They took me on old-fashioned 12-step calls. And they let me sit in the car and just watch what happened. And they took me into the living rooms, and they let me see the families that were struggling. And they let me watch how to work with a wet drunk. I learned all of that. I learned all of that in my first couple of years, hanging out with old men in donut shops. And I'm so incredibly grateful. I'm standing before you now. Those of you who were at the kickoff meeting the other night, you got this. We have my friends with Mike from Kansas City. I'm 29. I've been a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous now for 29 years as of Tuesday. And when I thank you. And what I can tell you is that in those 29 years, I've always been a member in good standing of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've had a home group. I've done some kind of service. I sponsor girls. I am sponsored well. I have a very, very rich prayer life. I have allowed my God to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Through all of the trials and tribulations and all the bright spots and rough spots, I have allowed God to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And my participation in that relationship with God has waxed and waned. Today I will tell you that, that God relieved me of the insanity of alcoholism. But the kind of insanity that I take to him today is the insanity of self-reliance. There are just those situations in my life today where I think, oh, I got this. I got this. If you ever have a conversation with me and you hear me say, I got it, oh my goodness. Would you just point out to me that I don't got it, that that God intervenes for me? And I was listening to Angie today, and Angie and I have a similar story. Over the surrender is a process. It's not an event. It's an absolute process. The more that's revealed to me, the more I have to surrender to God. The more that's revealed to me, the more I have to surrender. And so I just continue to give him layer after layer after layer after layer. I live in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and the application of those spiritual principles. And the more aptly I apply those spiritual principles, the more I see what kind of behavior needs to be addressed in me, because the standards of my behavior have risen. What was okay for me at 10 years is not okay for me at 20 years. And what was okay for me at 20 years is not okay for me at 29 years. I mean, my standards have come up. And so as my standards rise, my behavior has to get better, and I stand more accountable. And my road, the longer we're on the path, the narrower it gets. And so the more that is revealed to me through this constant work and reflection on who I am and what I am, and this relationship that I have with God, the more he reveals to me in my prayer and meditation. And I've given him everything in my life over and over and over. I've given him education and work and relationships with family and relationships with friends. And I've given him all of those ways that I'm very undisciplined. I've given him that stuff over and over and over, because as I dig, more, more is revealed to me. Like, I have held up every belief system I brought in here. I've had to take all of them out and hold them up to the light and see what was worth keeping and what needed to be discarded. One of the belief systems that I brought in here from childhood was that you don't trust anybody with money, because if they have money, they made it on the backs of poor people. Well, that's a belief system, right? So I had to bring that belief system in here and shine it up to the light and say, is that going to serve me well or not? Do I need to hate everybody who has money? Is that going to serve me well? And it was like, goodness, no, that's not going to serve me well at all. So I had to discard that. And I've had to do that with every single belief system. And some of them I've kept, and some of them I've discarded. And some of them that I kept originally, I have since had to discard, because it's just not okay anymore. I came in here and I had some preset ideas about what God was and what God wasn't. And some of the things that we say out loud to one another that I used to think were okay. And now today, I don't believe that they are at all. And I've had to allow God to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I have changed my perception and my concept of God as the years have gone. I started out very, very much as a child with this relationship with God. They sat me at the donut shop and they said, just write down a list of adjectives. If God could be anything you wanted him to be, what would he be? And I was like, well, he would love me unconditionally. He would forgive me even before I asked. He'd be really nice. And he'd have a plan for my life. And I gave that to them and they said, okay, then that's your concept of God. Start praying to him. And I started from there and I've allowed him to get bigger and I've allowed him to get bigger. And so anyway, I had given him every single area of my life except one. I had kept boys for my very own. Thank you very much. I was fairly certain that God did not know what handsome was. And so I was picking my own boys and I was having the kind of relationship I wanted to have with them. I'd been married and divorced and Alcoholics Anonymous. If you're a little bored, give that one a go. It really rustles up the home group. But I had, lots of boyfriends over the years and everything else. And, I've really learned how to make amends for relationships gone south. I was really good at it. And anyway, so I'd kept that and I was dating a man and he was not a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. His name was Lee. He was 6'1". He had a, razor shaped bald head and blue eyes and he was a major in the Marine Corps and he did the right thing for the right reasons most of the time. He was an infantry officer. People just followed him because he was walking somewhere. I mean, he was just a really, really great guy. And he and I were best friends and we golfed together and we rode Harleys cross country together. I mean, he was just my guy. And God was coming to me over and over and over. And God kept coming to me in my meditation and he kept saying, I have perfect love to give you and you're blocking me. Why are you blocking me? I have perfect love to give you. Get out of my way. And I kept saying, no, we're good. We're good. Like, I'm doing everything that you want me to do. And have you seen him? I mean, come on. And he's a good one this time. He's a really good guy. So just shh. And God cut, but and that's so on and on. And he reached a point where the only place I was comfortable was on my knees in prayer and meditation. And God kept coming to me and saying, I have perfect love to give you and you continue to block me. And what you people had taught me in here, and I had seen it demonstrated, is that if I was unwilling to let God get big, if I was unwilling to participate in an expanding relationship with him, I would eventually start to go backwards and I would drink again. Sometimes I forget that this is about staying sober. Sometimes I forget because I get really far away from the last drink that I had. And that's why I go to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, is to remember that this is about staying sober. Not only about staying sober, but this is about staying sober. And if I don't grow, I'll go. And God kept coming to me over and over and over. And finally I said, okay, I get it. Because I've always been the girl who was willing to settle for good enough. Always been the girl who was willing to settle for good enough. Because one of those belief systems that I had was that there was never enough to go around. And when you got just enough, hold on to it. And certainly don't set it down and go for something better. Just drop anchor where you are when you have enough. And so I was dropping anchor where I was because I had enough and he was good looking and I was in. And God kept coming to me in prayer and meditation and saying, please don't drop anchor here. Do not drop anchor here. I have perfect love for you. And what you're choosing is only good enough. It's not the best. And so finally I heard the message and I went home and I broke up with Lee and I let him go and I explained to him what was going on. And he said, let me get this straight. You're leaving me for God? And I said, yes, I'm leaving you for God. And he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, here's the deal. I have come to start to rely on you for things I'm supposed to rely on God for. And I can't do that. I can't do that. I must rely on God for all things, and I'm relying on man. I said, I've placed you in a position where God is supposed to sit, and I can't do that. And you're an incredible man, and I love you. I absolutely adore you, but I have to let you go, and I have to deepen my relationship with God. I'm going to go get baptized. I'm going to go become a Christian. I'm going to join the Catholic Church, and you're a distraction, and you're in my way, and you don't have a relationship with God, and I got to let you go. And he was like, but I love God. And I said, You don't pray, you don't do anything to demonstrate that you even have a relationship with God, and I've got to be in a relationship with someone who loves God the way I love him, and so I got to let you go. And I wept for months. And what I didn't know is that Lee left that conversation. He went and sat down with his battalion chaplain, and he said, "Chaps, Deb left me." And the chaplain said, "Well, my God, man, what did you do?" He said, "I didn't do anything." He said, "But he said, she, she's going to go become Catholic." And she said that I'm in her way and that she's relying on me for things she should be relying on God for. And the chaplain said, "Well, that makes sense to me." And he said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And the chaplain said, "Deb's pretty great, man. I think I'd go to mass if I were you." And so Lee came back to me, and he and I joined the Catholic Church together. We went through the whole formation process together, and I got baptized, and the two of us were confirmed in our faith together. And here's the deal. I have Alcoholics Anonymous. I know how to have a conversation with someone that's spiritual in nature, because you all have given me spiritual language over the years to learn, or to use in relationships. He didn't have that. And he wasn't a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He and I built that spiritual language together through the church. And so we grew in our relationship with one another throughout that year. So we were confirmed in April. At Easter, we got married in June. And in August, he left me to go to California to start to do workups to go to war. And so he did those workups, and they went to war, and they went to Iraq. And they were living outside of the wire in the streets of Fallujah. They were embedded with the Iraq Army. They were a training team. It was a very dangerous deployment. And I got to understand powerlessness like I had never understood powerlessness before. But along with powerlessness, for me, came the desire to dig deeper into my relationship with God, because I understood by that point that the only way I was going to be able to survive this was to rest in the arms of God. And so I dug, and I went deeper into prayer and meditation, and I was introduced to the idea of practicing living in the presence of God. And through that practice of living in the presence of God, I was able to see God as this golden light who was shaped like a human without any features. And that light was really big. And I practiced seeing God everywhere that I went as I moved through my day. And when I would go to bed at night, I would lay down, and Lee was deployed to war, and people were shooting at him on purpose. And I would lay down with worry, and I would ask God to come and spoon me and wrap me up and hold me, and he would do that. And I grew in my understanding and in my relationship with God, and I rested in his arms. And I came to understand that there is no room to rely on man for the things I should be relying on God for. We can love each other as much as we want, but we are human and we are limited. And God is forever, and he's everything. And today I still practice living in the presence of God, but I learned how to do that through the powerlessness of having him go off to war. And he came home from Iraq, and he was home for a little while, and the deployment to Afghanistan got moved up. And he went out and he did workups, and he snapped in as the XO of 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, and which means he was essentially the vice president of a 1,200-man company. And they went over to Afghanistan, and they went out to Helmand Province where we had not been before, and they took the fight to the Taliban. They were doing distributed operations, and it was very, very dangerous. And they were just losing one after the next after the next. It was a very, very bloody summer for his battalion. And it reached a point where I didn't even want to open another email from him, because every time I opened an email, we were best friends, and so he shared everything with me. And there for a while, every time I opened an email, I learned about someone else who had been taken. And one of the emails I opened when I was talking actually at the Texas State Convention, I'd opened an email and it said, "Honey, another IED, nothing left but a boot." And my heart was breaking, because I knew that there were things that were happening to him over there that he wasn't going to come back from. That when he came home from war, he was going to be a different man. And I didn't know I barely knew how to be a wife, let alone how to be a wife to someone who had suffered like that and who had come home and would be so different. And I had to go deeper into my relationship with God. And I would sit with him, and I would talk to him, and I would say, "God, you got to get ready, because you're going to have to just work through me to take care of him, because I don't have what it takes, and I know that. And God would just tell me, it's okay, I got you. I got you. And Lee came home from that deployment, and he was a different guy, and it took a while before he came all the way home from that deployment. And God walked me through each day, one day at a time. How I spoke, how I acted, what I did for him, how he and I reacted to one another, all of that. I introduced him to living in the presence of God. I introduced him to the golden light. And he and I started doing prayer and meditation together, and we started reading scriptures in the morning together. And God brought him the rest of the way home. And I was working for the Marine Corps at the time. I was working for the same base where he was stationed, doing what I do for a living. And one night I get home, I beat him home. I worked 16 hours and he worked 17 hours. So I was expecting him home anytime. And I fell asleep sitting up, waiting on him to get there. And I accidentally fell asleep, and all of a sudden I startled awake and he wasn't home. And I called the cell phone and I couldn't get a hold of him. And I called the battalion and I got a hold of one of the guys and I said, "Has anybody seen Major Helton?" And through some coercing, one of the captains gets on the phone who shouldn't have been in the office that night. He gets on the phone and I talk him into telling me what happened. And he said, "I'm so sorry, Deb, but Lee was killed on his way home." And I'm here to tell you that there are things that are going to happen in this world where God is going to have to be enormous in your life. It's going to happen to all of us. There are going to be those phone calls in those times when all I can do is stand there and cry. And this was one of those times, and I'm holding the phone and I just hear that Lee is not ever coming home again. And I said, "God, I can't breathe. Help me." And what I heard was, "I'm here." Not, "This didn't happen. This is a bad dream. You're going to wake up for me. It's going to be fine." None of those platitudes. "I'm here." And that golden light came up behind me and wrapped itself around me like a lover does when he's wrapping up his beloved. And God just stood there and held me. And he said, "I'm here." And I grieved out loud. I started grieving from that moment, and I grieved out loud, and I went all the way through the process. I sent out 3 text messages in the middle of the night to 3 groups in Alcoholics Anonymous, had been my home groups in various places across the country. You know, three phone calls means that all 30,000 people that know you are going to find out about it immediately. That's how we roll. And the Marines come to the house, and as they're at the house, we stay up all night, and they're telling me stories about Lee, and I'm telling them stories about him. And so, and we're all processing the fact that this leader of Marines is now gone. And and Colonel John Reed is sitting with me, and he was the CO of 27. And he and I are sitting out front, and the sun is going to come up any minute. And I realized that I had sent out the call to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I looked at John, and he is the picture perfect Marine Corps officer. He should be on posters. You know, he is perfectly coiffed at all times. He is in top tip physical health. He uses full sentences for everything he does. He is just that guy. Like, his shirt stays tucked in even after he's been sitting down. It's amazing. And I'm having this conversation, and I said, "Oh my God, John, there's something you need to know about me." And he said, "Okay, what is it?" And I said, "I'm a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I've been sober for 22 years. And he said, "Okay." And I said, "John, what that means is that they're coming." And he said, "Okay." I said, "John, they're a motley crew. They don't look like the people you're used to hanging out with." He said, "Okay." I said, "They're going to take over everything. I mean, everything. And you're just going to have to let them." And he said, "Okay." He said, "I just have one question." I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Does this group have a leader?" I said, "Oh, yes, it does. You'll know exactly who she is as soon as she gets here." And the sun, and I said, "And they're going to be here as soon as the sun pops up over that mountain." And he said, "Okay, I got it." And he's looking toward the driveway, and I'm looking this way, and we're sitting in a period of silence. And I watched his face, and he went like this. "I think they're here." And there were 3 members of my home group that walked up this steep hill, walked up my driveway. And the first member of my home group that John saw was Matthew. Matthew is 6'4". He had blue hair. He wore clothes that don't match on purpose just to see if you're paying attention. He's gay and he prances a little. He has lots of piercings. And that is John's introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. And all the old timers come to my house and they're sitting around the table. And I asked one of them who just lost his wife, and I said, I don't know what to do. What should I do? And he said, sit still and grieve. Grieve now so you don't grieve forever. And make no decisions based on fear or sadness. None. And I said, okay. He said, so stay with us and do this work. And I said, okay, I'll stay. And I sat tight. And the old timers are having a conversation and they pulled me into the room and they said, look, when you get angry with God, he said, just be angry with God. Don't stop yourself. Just go ahead and put all your anger on God. He's big enough. He can take it. And I'm standing there and I'm listening to them and I thought, okay, all right, I'm going to get angry. I'm going to be angry with God. God's big enough. He's going to be able to take it. And so I'm like, okay, this makes sense. This makes sense. But then I thought, wait a minute, God's my best friend. I don't want to put anger in the middle of that relationship. God is absolutely my best friend. There's got to be another way. There has to be another way. And at that time, my phone rings and there's a newcomer who has my phone and she's taken messages from everybody. She brings me the phone and she said, there's a guy on the phone. His name is Walter from Houston. And he says he has a message for you from God. Do you want to take his call? And I said, yes, give me the phone. Because it's an old timer from Houston, Texas, an Alcoholics Anonymous. And he's been sober now over 40 years. And he's one of my messengers. And I get on the phone and Walter's an old Marine and he and Lee are big fans of one another. And he said, darling, I love you. And I'm so sorry. And I said, thank you. And he said, but God wanted me to call you right away and tell you that there are things that happen in this world that break his heart. And Lee's death was one of them. And so he will be grieving alongside you and you're to rest in his arms. And I said, oh my God, that's the other way. I don't have to get angry with him and I don't have to soil that relationship with anger. I can rest in God's arms and do this work. And so I got everybody's attention in my house and I said, all right, everybody listen up. There are things that happen in this world that break God's heart, and Lee's death was one of them, and he will be grieving along with us. So there'll be no more talk about being angry with God. Does everybody understand? And everybody went. I sat still. I grieved out loud. I let everybody into my grief. I said, you know what? I'm not going to put an anchor around your neck, and I'm not going to make you sit with me long term. I said, but I'm going to need you to visit me in my sadness. So come on in and let's do this. And I stayed engaged in Alcoholics Anonymous and I kept all my commitments. I was on the road speaking at one of these things about 9 days after Lee was killed. I spoke at the International Conference of Young People in AA, with 2,400 young people in AA, about 3 weeks after he was killed, because what I knew is that I needed to go to work and keep my commitments. I didn't know anything else, but I went to work and I kept my commitments and I grieved out loud and I did the work. And what I can tell you is that the heavy lift of grief left me and I was able to get out of the desert and move to New Orleans. I got to live in New Orleans for a year where I ate all kinds of things. I had butter running up my elbows almost every single day. I gained 15 pounds. I danced in the streets to all of the live music and I came all the way awake. And then I was promoted and I was moved to Washington, D.C. My office was in the Pentagon. I stood outside the Pentagon on my first day and I started to cry a little and I thought, oh my God, how does a girl like me get to be in a place like this? God gets big. He will get as big as you'll let him get. And there will be days when you're going to need to rely on the relationship you have with him, not on the relationship you wish you had with him. That's been my experience. And our goal in Alcoholics Anonymous, guys, is not only to get sober, but is to increasingly have this loving experience with God, no matter what our concept of God is. Today, I live on the dance floor with God, and most days I let him lead. And when I let him lead, he twirls me all over the place, and I have an incredible time. Sometimes I step on his toes, and I try to lead instead. And those are the days that I'm 29 years sober, and I'm sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm talking to you about how I screwed it up one more time. It's been an incredible weekend. Thank you so much for having me here. Live life large and let God give big with you. Thanks.